Hello and welcome to another experimental soup. Now today we're not filming down in the shed or the workshop, we're filming up in the office, and the reason for that is because we're going to be doing some map analysis and comparison. Now when archaeologists are asked what do you do for a living, people tend to assume that what we do is digging. They tend to think of skills like digging, or maybe a familiarity with human anatomy. For example, if you find a skeleton, it's worthwhile knowing what part of the skeleton it is that you've uncovered. Maybe they assume that we're very good at reading ancient languages, or that we're familiar with ancient customs, the way that people used to think in the past, in the deep past. But very rarely do they expect us to say, well, we're very good at analysing maps. But for the most part, archaeologists tend to be quite good at comparing old maps with new maps. Now, sometimes it's a very simple comparison. For example, we are here, and the site we're interested in is, well, it's over there. So let's go over there. But in other instances, it's a little bit more complicated, especially in urban environments. Often what we're dealing with is a very simple question, and that is there any archaeology left to be found on this particular site? You see, if a big building like a hospital or a car park or a shopping centre is constructed in a town or a city, it will often obliterate or just seal up archaeology, and it'll mean that it's just not accessible, or it's far too expensive to get at the archaeology that was there. And an initial analysis using maps is a really good way of getting a sense of what might or might not be on a site. It's a brilliant way of well, saving time and money. Rather than going there and digging and finding nothing, you can actually confirm, with a certain margin for error, whether or not it's likely that you're going to find something on a site. So this whole exercise has actually come about because Reese wants to do a dig in Geelong in Victoria, where he lives in Australia. And he sent over this map. Now this map is a map of Geelong. It dates from the 1850s, and we have to the north of the map a hospital and benevolent asylum. Quite a funky Victorian phrase there. We also have to the south an electric telegraph reserve. Again, very much Victorian features on this map. And in the middle we have the site of interest. This is actually the target block, quite literally a city block. So we have to the north of the block Myers Street, to the south of the block Little Myers Street, and streets to the west and to the east. Now what I've done is I've zoomed in and taken a grab of that particular block, and here we have a close-up. So we have these buildings here. This is what Reese wants to know more about. There are 6 buildings, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them, and they were an army barracks. What we're looking at actually is a Victorian army barracks, and Reese wants to know if he turned up there and did some geophysics, maybe even an excavation, would he possibly find something? And this was a question that, well, he wanted to have answered fairly quickly. So I offered to do this analysis for him, because I quite enjoy it, to be honest. I'm a little bit geeky in that sense. So what have I done? Well, what I've done is I've gone to a brilliant resource, or initial resource, and that is Google Maps. Google Maps is it's brilliant because it's a publicly accessible catalogue of satellite imagery from anywhere on the planet. Now, you wouldn't necessarily use Google Maps in the end stages of an analysis, or for example in the presentation of a report, but it's very good for this first step, for this desk-based what might be there. What's the percentage chance of there being something on site? So I've gone to Google Maps and I've found the same block today. So we have Myers Street to the north, Little Myers Street to the south, we have a street to the west and a street to the east. And we can see there's Geelong Prison and also these buildings here, which actually, ironically enough, are a modern army barracks. Now if we very quickly just pop back to the 1850s map, you'll see that there's a jail next to the army barracks. And today, let's just go back to the satellite imagery, there's a prison next to the army barracks. Now this is something that we're relying on, folks, and that is a continuity of use. You see, people tend to be quite lazy, and they also tend to be quite greedy. So when it comes to, for example, land ownership, most people, most especially businesses and corporations, they won't relinquish their ownership of even an inch of land. And this tends to result in a constant, or rather, sorry, continuity rather, of the shapes of land that go down through maps. For example, a rectangular field may be split in two when two sons inherit it, but nonetheless the overall shape is still there. And the same goes especially in cities in Australia and also, for example, in the US. Because they're relatively young cities, there hasn't been much time for land to change its shape. The ownership of those plots of land have been fairly constant, and in some cases the use of those plots of land have been fairly constant. In cities like York in Britain, or rather, sorry, in northern England, it's a similar situation. For 1,000 years, though, there's been a street and land ownership continuity. Of course, what happens on the land has changed, and the ownership of the number of plots of land. So, for example, what was 5 or 6 plots of land has now become one big plot, but there's still a street continuity in York. But in a much younger city, like in Geelong, this is a very useful tool. This is a very useful feature. So what I've done is I've taken this satellite image and I've actually put it on top of the 1850s map in a program called GIMP. Now GIMP is a open source version of Photoshop. I highly recommend it. If you're into Photoshop and you haven't quite got the money for it, which I haven't, GIMP is a very good tool. And what I've done here is I've got on 2 separate layers in the image, the satellite image from today and the 1850s map. Now, it did take a little bit of time. I had to rotate the satellite image a little bit to the left. You'll notice that on Google Maps it is leaning to the northeast there. And I also had to scale it. In other words, I had to change the size of the Google Maps image to fit the rectangle and the street layout on the 1850s map. That took some time. I didn't think that was worthwhile filming because frankly it's a bit boring to watch. But what I've ended up with is quite a nicely matched and lined up pair of images. For example, in the northwest corner here, what was officers' quarters on the 1850s map lines up really nicely actually with the street and with the modern building which is on that site there. This land ownership here, this little corner of a building, lines up almost perfectly. Little Myers Street lines up almost perfectly just there. And that's more or less what I've tried to do all the way around, has been to match up land usage today with land usage in the 1850s. Now, as I say, there is a margin of error here, and in the past you would have been doing this with maps of different sizes, different scales. You have to try and maybe redraw or print out a map at a different scale, maybe on tracing paper, try and get them to line up. There's always a margin of error when you're comparing maps from different eras, because there's different capabilities in terms of drawing the map, in terms of accuracy of surveying, but also as well in terms of the scale that the map was drawn at. So I'm sort of trading here errors. I'm trading physical paper for digital paper, as it were. But it's just as accurate as doing it by hand. And I would say more convenient. So let's go back to GIMP. Well, let's see what we can see, shall we? Well, first of all, as I say, you've got the modern prison, and below it, or rather in 1850s, you've got the jail. That matches quite nicely. You've got the modern barracks, and in the 1850s, the Victorian barracks. They match up quite nicely. But there's actually an even more subtle use of land on this block here, which actually is still present today, and that is here we have 3 distinct sections of land. This is this rectangle here on which the army barracks sits. There's this strip of land in the middle, this sort of elongated rectangle. There's also this square here to the east of the block, and if we bring up the Google Maps image, there's actually still a 3 split, as it were, or even a 4 split in the land use, because actually later on this central rectangle was split in half, and you can see that here. So here we have the barracks block, this barrack rectangle. We have the thin elongated rectangle still there today with the split in the middle, and that was eventually asphalted over to extend the car park perhaps. And here we have the square upon which the jail used to sit, but the prison now sits. So again, the lining up is looking quite good. The continuity in land use, the fact that people don't want to relinquish even an inch of their land, is playing to our advantage here. So what's the next step? Well, the next step is I add a new layer, an invisible layer, a little bit like adding tracing paper over the whole thing. And I get rid of the Google Maps image. There we go. And I zoom in. Let's zoom in to the army barracks. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw on the invisible layer and trace out our army barracks from the 1850s. Again, relatively rough, but no less rough than if you were doing it with a piece of paper and a pencil. So as I say, I'm trading here in accuracies, but I think it's a fairly good one-for-one trade. Digital paper instead of physical paper. So I'm very carefully tracing them over here with a rectangular brush shape and a really nice clear green colour. So here we go. One more building to go. Voila. So why have I done that? Well, I've done that so that when I bring back the Google Maps image, we have an instant comparison. Now at the moment it's looking, well, first of all, yes, this confirms the continuity of land use. These four buildings here, it seems, have been concreted over by the modern barracks. But these two buildings here seem to be peeking out actually onto public land. This is the fence of the modern army barracks here, and here we have a little green patch before you get to the road where some cars are parked up. And well, this block here is sticking out into public land, and a little bit of this block is sticking out just there. So far it's looking quite promising. But is there anything else we can do to confirm this alignment, to try and really, I suppose, up the percentages on this particular analysis? Well, if we go back to the map and get rid of the Google Maps image, we can trace over a couple of other things on the invisible layer. So let's trace over what was the warden's hut just here, this sort of almost like a boat shape kind of structure just here. Okay, there we go. And let's also trace over the old jail. It's quite a big rectangle, rectilinear form or structure. I do like the word rectilinear. It makes me think of archaeology. We don't say rectangles in archaeology, we say rectilinear. Anyway, back to the map, and we've traced over those two features, and let's bring back the Google Maps image. And again, it looks quite favourable. The old warden's hut, or building, sits very squarely within what is now, actually let's get rid of the green layer, some greenery on the prison land. Now this alignment is it's another form of confirmation, because the other buildings which are now there today actually seem to respect what was what was a building. So there's a continuity in land use and continuity in orientation of buildings. The right angles at which they're being built on this map here seems to be consistent, which is quite funky. Also as well, it looks like the old jail may well be part of what is the western wing of the modern prison. Now the alignment there isn't perfect, but then again I imagine that this structure has been extended and rebuilt quite extensively. Also as well, it's worthwhile remembering that what we're looking at is an image which isn't straight down. There's a slight angle here, and that's evidenced by, for example, shadows on the map. Shadows just here. And what you need to remember is that we're looking at where the walls, for example, touch the ground. So it may well be that that does line up quite nicely. But even if it doesn't, I think the fact that it's still on the east-west orientation is promising. Now in the middle, just to confirm the land usage continuity, if we get rid of the Google map again, we have that line that runs down the western side of this thin strip. If we go back to the image, actually that line is still there. It's in line with this green block here. I'll just get rid of this again. That green block at the top, just there, and it continues down here, splitting these two buildings apart, or rather making, going between these two buildings and running down here. On the eastern side of that strip of land, well, again, remember we're looking at where these walls touch the ground, and I think that line just there is actually quite a good match. It lines up quite favourably. So again, all of this is pointing to the fact that actually this has worked quite well. And these two maps sit on top of each other fairly comfortably. So we've done that particular bit of analysis. Now, where might we be able to dig and possibly find something? Well, let's go back to the map. If we add another invisible layer to the whole thing, and this time I'm going to draw, I think, in red, and I'm going to zoom in. And Rees was saying that he doesn't necessarily want to dig on army land because there's a certain access issue going on there, but he can dig on public land. So this area just here looks quite good, as does this area just here, just outside the barracks. Also as well, he may be able to get access to prison land and dig just here on what was the warden's hut, but what is now some greenery within the prison land. I reckon those three areas have a high probability of finding archaeology. There's also the possibility, if he went into the army barracks, of being able to dig just here on a patch of green and find something. But again, he may not want to do that. So there you have it, folks, a map analysis and comparison, where I've tried to show you how we use features in the landscape, especially features that don't move too much, to anchor two maps together. And in doing so, we're able to, well, with a fairly high percentage of probability, predict where archaeology might be in the landscape. I've used Google Maps, GIMP, and also a freely available map from a library to do this. And hopefully you might be able to do this at home. If you have a site that you're interested in, why not give it a go? I'd love to see your results too. Nonetheless, hopefully this has been interesting for you. It's not necessarily the most exciting thing that archaeologists do, but I think it's very funky and very useful. And there we have it. I'll report back to Rees post haste.